Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be going through the top new fantasy releases that I picked up within the second quarter of the year, and we're just going to jump straight into it. The first one is one that I've not yet had the opportunity to talk about in a new fantasy releases wrap up, nor have I had the opportunity to talk about it in a review, but there is an in-depth discussion that is planned, so be on the lookout for that if you'd like to hear spoiler-filled thoughts for that, and it would be Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. I absolutely can see this being somewhat of a polarizing read for a lot of people, as it is very, very wicked. And I think V.E. Schwab is known, and I even have pointed out in the past, that regardless of how different the stories are themselves, the plots, the characters, there is always something to the authorial voice that has this sense of malevolence to it. There's always something that's a little bit dark and sinister, regardless of whatever story is being told. And to me, this one really took that quality to V.E. Schwab's works and had that shine in a way that I found really satisfying. So if you're somebody who has read a fair amount of V.E. Schwab, maybe some things have worked, other things haven't. The one that I would say this is the most comparable to would actually be The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, both in how it's structured and also the writing style itself. However, I think Addie LaRue has this sadness to it, certainly, and there's kind of this existential questioning that occurs within Addie LaRue, whereas in this story, I think a lot of it is about what makes us monstrous. And so as a result, it's like, what if Addie LaRue was much, much darker? Not necessarily sadder or more depressing, but what if it was much more villainous in nature? So in a sense, I think it's like if you combined Addie LaRue with Vicious, which was, for me, a fantastic recipe. I actually was surprised how uncomfortable I was reading parts of this story, because something that I think is really, really difficult to accomplish with your character work is that line between morally gray and villainous. And that's something that a lot of people have had conversations before about. Are there really any true villains these days? Because a lot of times villains can be so cartoonish when they're pure evil. But then when you make a really compelling villain, you then ask yourself, are they actually a villain, or are they just morally gray and in opposition to your protagonist? And I think that while you're reading this story, there is this sense of discomfort, because there are moments with the characters where you think, I think you're kind of a bad person. And then you think, well, I almost don't feel like I should be judging them because I'm looking at their origin, you could say, their origin stories. And you're recognizing how they got to this point. They've gone through a lot of horrific things. But now they're kind of making decisions that are horrible in and of themselves, and am I supposed to still now feel bad for them? And that's such a hard thing to accomplish, because usually the answer is much easier. You're like, no, they've crossed the line officially. And even when they did cross the line, there is this like, is she trying to make me feel bad? Because I don't feel bad. And I loved that feeling, but I certainly can see for some people, them just finding the characters to be awful and not wanting to have that feeling of discomfort throughout. And also, of course, maybe the writing style and the characterization things aren't going to work. But for me, it was such a masterclass in what is basically, to me, like the most compelling of villain origin stories type of story, without just shoving in your face, no, look at their villainous, or no, look, we should feel bad for them because look where they were before. I don't feel like it necessarily was one of those two extremes. It sat somewhere incredibly in the middle, which I really value. There are two main perspectives in the story, and then there's this mysterious third perspective that very briefly is shown early on and then becomes more of a focus later in the story. And it's kind of a how are they all going to come together sort of setup. And initially with the two main perspectives, you don't really know how they're connected or related, and you assume that they are going to come in contact with each other in some fashion at some point. But you are looking at modern day, and then you are looking at the past. So there is kind of this historical fiction feel to this. If you're somebody who prefers your fantasy works to truly be fantastical in that there's a magic system and an entirely new world and things like that, then this might not be the story for you. But I thought the way that we utilized the fantasy pieces within our own world really spoke to the themes incredibly. But you are primarily at the beginning, as I was saying, looking at these two perspectives, one that's modern, one that's in the past. And so it has this historical fiction feel, and you're really seeing the way that people are forced into certain circumstances, they're forced into certain boxes, they're forced to suppress certain feelings and thoughts and desires, and how you have this continued oppression of a person and entire groups of people, and kind of what that can do to an individual. And there's so much too, and this is why I thought I gotta do some kind of discussion for this, so that's on the way. But there's so much too, I think, the way that it is shown that this kind of festering develops within people and how it can come out in the ugliest of ways. And I thought it was incredibly done. But also, there are so many other themes that are unexpected about this story, about manipulation, about the ways that people can rationalize what they're doing because of the trauma that they've endured. And you understand it, and you can like kind of feel for them initially, but it doesn't excuse what happens later. There's just so many layers to this story that I thought were phenomenal. Again, though, this is not, I really think this was incredible. I really don't think it's going to be for everybody. It's just very dark and very, very wicked. And I personally absolutely loved it. We're going to stay in a similar lane, and then we're going to completely switch gears. So this middle one is one that I have talked about quite a lot ever since I picked it up, and that would be Grave Empire. And the thing that I always say about this is it has shown me that I really do enjoy eldritch horror fantasy, because I think that it shined in this story. You do have a couple of different perspectives in this one as well, one of whom is a character that is assigned to this very jungle-esque place where there are mysterious things happening and you hear screaming in the night, but apparently nobody's actually there, and everybody is kind of like, you're gonna go insane here, but we're all in this together. So already the way that you've kind of sectioned an entire group of people off, and there's this questioning of reality, and then also you're just waiting because the second something creepy happens, you think, I think that thing actually just happened though. I don't think this time that was your grasp on reality failing you. I think that might have actually been real, but oh no, if that's real, then you're headed into danger, and then now people are dying, and there's just this sense of like, oh, every little tiny thing that builds up is just increasing that tension. So that's fantastic in that perspective, and you have no idea what's going on. You have a character who has a little bit more knowledge as to maybe the threats that are going to impact the world, so you're kind of getting knowledge through them. And then you have somebody else who I've described before as being one of the most pure evil type of characters that I've ever encountered, but not in a cartoonish way. They just genuinely, you're like, oh, you're the scum of the earth. And I really liked the way that character was done. I loved the way that character was done. So there is kind of a overarching theme between Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil and Grave Empire, which is that I guess I'm really on board for really well-written, awful people, of which this character is one of the worst ever. Regardless, I find that the horror elements, they're kind of almost unexplainable and truly frightening, in my opinion, and they can be grotesque but disturbing in a way that doesn't just feel like it's for shock value, and you really wonder, like, oh my gosh, if I was well, I know for myself, if I was in these situations, I would die immediately, or I would run away. I'd still probably die. But I really feel like this author has a gift at accomplishing this, and I really enjoyed the Empire of the Wolf series by this author. This is in the same world, and you do not have to have read the other to read this. They're very loosely connected, and the time periods are quite different. So you're going to see a lot more advancements in technology in Grave Empire than the other series. There is still, however, this kind of backdrop of what the eldritch horror is rooted in that is present in both stories, and that's kind of the really unifying factor, I would say. And within the Empire of the Wolf, it's more traditional fantasy setting, and certainly I thought that the eldritch horror was great, but it was like slowly revealing itself, whereas in this story it is really front and center, and I am so glad that this author is getting more recognition and that they were able to continue on past that initial trilogy, because I just think that they have a gift for writing this, and I have such an appreciation now for this kind of fantasy, and I really want more. I mostly just want the sequel at this point, though, to this specific one, because I'm invested. If you are looking for a disturbing, strange, and I would say well done characterization type of fantasy story, then I think that this is a great one. If you are looking, though, for more in-depth thoughts about this one, because this is more so serving as an overview, I will have my video linked where I do go more in-depth. It was fantastic. I thought it was great. And now to completely switch gears, the last one for my top 3 would be A Forgery of Fate. This was so much fun. It was delightful. It just felt like a return to that sort of adventure feel that I think a lot of us have a lot of nostalgia for, but that it doesn't seem as prevalent in today's fantasy landscape as it once was, and reading this made me miss it, and it also has established this author as being the author for me if I want this style of story. The setup for A Forgery of Fate is that you have this young girl who very much cares about her family. And that's something I think is very true for this author in general with the works that they have, is that they're really good at establishing the stakes for the characters. And they're very personal stakes. You feel very immediately connected to them because they care so much about their family, and they're willing to do whatever they have to do to provide for them. And this becomes really a pressing factor for them when their father has gone missing and they don't really know what's happened. They assume the worst. There's still some hope, but at the end of the day, they think, I don't think our father is coming back. I think something happened. So our character is using her skills as a painter to forge paintings and try to make money that way to get by. And the father's disappearance has had a very negative impact on the mother, who has in a lot of ways attempted to provide for her daughters, but she at the end of the day has made some pretty poor decisions, which has left them destitute, and our character is doing everything she can to provide for her sisters and her mother. And one day she finds that she is suddenly whisked off into the dragon underwater kingdom, and from there is where you really get that fantastical, lush, beautiful, vibrant world building that I think Elizabeth Lim is very good at. And I really just had such a great time. I thought the beginning established, as I was saying, the care and the stakes, and then later you get this wondrous feeling in the setting. Also, as I stated, I think to write that more fun action adventure style of story that's just pretty, it feels like you're watching a movie, and it's just so colorful and filled with life. I just don't feel like we get that as much these days. So I really liked that feeling that I got when I dove into this. And this is why I like there being all different kinds of fantasy out there, because the juxtaposition between Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil and this and Grave Empire, they're all so different from each other, and I think they're all fantastic, hence why they're in my top 3 for this quarter. But that's it. If you are looking for more in-depth thoughts for Grave Empire and A Forgery of Fate, I have gone more in depth. If you're interested in that, I'll have it linked. There should be a discussion coming up very soon for Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, so I'm really looking forward to that. If you want to see those more in-depth thoughts, then be on the lookout. If you're interested in checking out any of these books for yourself, I'll of course have them linked, as well as any of my other reviews that I've done this quarter, my playlist for reviews and wrap-ups, those sorts of things. But thanks so much for watching. I'd love to know what have been your top new releases so far this year. Thanks so much, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.